When I try to make sense of what I've learned from my fieldwork, as opposed to what are the voices that you find in urban theory or in informality, I found that two bodies of work that are really hegemonic, influential in these two fields are unfit for purpose, misleading to understand what's going on the ground. So my presentation starts, so these bodies of work are the post-colonial narratives on the African cities and the market fundamentalism or neoliberal economics approaches to economic informality. I'm going to start reviewing what I think are the problems with this theory, to then move to show what the book does to move beyond what I see as the limitation of this kind of body of work. So it is safe to say that post-colonial approaches to the African city has become really hegemonic, and they represent a major shift in the way we understand the city, which was in the 60s, 70s, up to the 80s, I would say, understood as chaos, dystopia, as things that don't work. While this body of work, the post-colonial, comes in and say, hold on a second, we need to understand the order and functionality of the African city, an order that doesn't follow of the West, is not Eurocentrically defined, but is order nonetheless. And as I was saying, it is becoming hegemonic if you look at keynote speeches at conference, position of power as editors in urban journals. So it's a momentum for hope in urban studies, and I want to interrogate what is the empirics behind this hope, what is the theoretical formulation, and what is the political agenda that this kind of scholarship puts forward. It's all about, post-colonial approaches is all about saying we need to move beyond this normative, teleological, Eurocentric reading of African cities as things that don't work. We need to move away from this materialistic obsession with urban realities as economic failure. And we need to move beyond political economy, which is the approach of this book, and developmentalism, which is a shorthand for attention to different levels of development as a way to understand the city. I have 4 quotes to pin down the work of the scholars. Apologies for that, but they are useful to really identify what we are talking about. And these are all big guys in the field. Abdul Malik Simon tells us urban life should not be seen as a series of policies gone wrong. Agency and determination by urban Africans to find their own way is key to understanding urban societies in Africa. Petersen, director of the African Center for Cities in Cape Town, says, we locate slums with their teeming complexity in a black box devoid of complex agency and determinateness. There is a very bold attack on political economy and materiality, which I think is visible in the work of the book who wrote a very famous and influential book about Kinshasa. And he says what one needs in order to turn an open space into a garage is not a building named garage, but rather the idea of a garage. And my objection would be, don't you need the resource to equip this garage? Don't you need access to land and all the political economy relations that come with it to start a garage? And in the most bold way, Robinson say enough of calling Maputo, Dar es Salaam, Nairobi as cities that don't work. All cities are best understood as ordinary in their own way. So it is important also to stress this is not just theoretical as a talk. It is a talk that has the ambition to come with very important policy and political agendas. And the agenda is that if we open our eyes to the practices of the everyday, which is a term that comes a lot up in this work, they can become the touchstone of radical imagining and intervention. So our role as academics, committed scholars, is to recuperate from this too nihilistic narrative the humanity and by extension, quote again, generative powers of the ordinary. Simon talks about African cities as cities built on people as infrastructure. So the idea is that policy formulation to have better cities should draw on such infrastructure that people are. Now, I find this work very convoluted and full of very dense work. And I apply some very basic layman type of questions. What is the ordinary? What do people at the grassroots do every day when they wake up in the morning? What do concepts such as people as infrastructure and generative powers really mean? From what sources do these generative powers that are referred to generate? To what extent are these generative powers able to make a dent on poverty, which they reassure us they are not romanticizing, and do this kind of post-colonial work has anything to say about the way in which this grinding poverty is generated in the first place. I think this is an interest that is both to debunk the theory but also to understand the political agenda, because I wonder what can we reasonably think in terms of radical interventions to improve the lives of people living in poverty in cities if we can't understand or address the root causes of this poverty? I also ask myself whether it's true that political economy as an approach is by definition prone to teleology, functionalism and reductionism. I also wonder whether to talk about every city as ordinary isn't a case of extreme relativism, and that leads me to ask whether there are other and better ways to understand the African urban experience in more genuinely comparative terms. When I apply these questions to the writings of these people, I walk away empty-handed, because this is, for instance, another quote from Natal and Bembe, who are key authors, and they respond to the objection that people as infrastructure really doesn't mean anything by saying that the difficulty we having to act through the provisionality that people as infrastructure implies is that the meanings of the tactics employed can hardly be pinned down. It might be true, but the problem is that you don't find a significant real fieldwork effort in this work before we conclude that it's difficult to pin down the tactics of the poor. Simone again talks about innumerable possibilities of combination, interchange that preclude any definitive judgment on efficacy or impossibilities. And while it's true that researching the city is about open-ended fluidity and uncertainty, I think our work should be to understand which of these uncertain situations takes place more often than not, which are the exceptions. And then the most important question is, what do people at the grassroots or ordinary citizens do when they wake up in the morning? Which leads me to understand how this post-colonial scholarship conceptualized the informal economy. That's a quote again by Peters, as I say, clearly, for as long as the contemporary capitalist system persists, uneven and highly exclusionary, it is likely that it will serve the interests of the poor to return their autonomy. So the key idea is that the informal economy is a space of autonomy from the exclusion of capitalism, and that is a theme that comes time and again. Here Robinson again talks about autonomous and inventive future by informals. This is misleading, as I will go on to explain, but also leads me to the second theoretical entry point of the book, which is, as I said, the mainstream economics neoliberal understanding of informality, which is best associated with the writings of Hernando de Soto, who famously said that the poor do not so much break the law as the law breaks them. In other words, behind the explosion of informal economic activities in the cities of the South is this choice by people that rise up against unnecessary regulation by the government, and in such a way that force a kind of deregulation from below. It's also important to reflect on what kind of actors you find in the informal economy according to this kind of scholarship, and again to notice how bold the attack on political economy here is. Here De Soto is saying Marx would be shocked to find out that in the informal economy you don't find the oppressed proletarians that are the protagonists of Marxist writing, but rather oppressed extra-legal small entrepreneurs. So this idea that informality is about small-scale entrepreneurs and the self-employed people who try to get by with the very small activities that they own. And of course, again, this is a narrative that comes with very serious policy implication, because if you frame informality as a self-employed people pulling themselves by the bootstraps, what follows is that we need microcredit, we need formalization of property rights, we need programs from micro-enterprise development. And what the book tries to say is that this way of understanding informality is irrelevant to the realities faced by poor people whose only asset often is their own labor, as it is the case of the Dalla Dalla workers that are so protagonist in the book. So, two theoretical bodies of work, two different notions of agency, of the power of the poor to shape reality out there. And what they share is the misleading nature in which they think about agency without paying attention to the structural constraints, barriers, economic, political, social, against which any meaningful, and I would add not patronizing, reading of the agency of the poor should, in my opinion, be framed. I think if you think about informality and ask yourself what would be a political economy approach to informality, I think it's safe to say that the starting point is to say that the informal economy cannot be understood as a space of autonomy, exclusion from capitalism. The reality is that there is a wealth of literature, often ignored by this kind of work, that shows that informal work for the poor is about operating in two sets of dramatically oversupplied markets. One is the markets for small-scale trading. In other words, markets that are very easy to enter because of the low cost of these activities as a startup. As a result, these are sectors that are oversupplied, so that typically in Nairobi, like in Dar es Salaam, you find the very poor trying to sell the same thing that the other very poor are trying to sell, and that undermines the profitability. But then again, the very neglected kind of market is the labor market. There is reality that for the very poor, often life is about working for other people without contracts, without protection from the formal sector, which is therefore not autonomy from capitalism, but incorporation in a very brutal form of capitalism, a capitalism without state regulation. So we need to ask, where is this dysfunctional? You might call me normative, Eurocentric, but we need to ask, where is this dysfunctional situation of oversupplied labor market and the small-scale trading markets come from? And I think that's where we begin to see how urbanization in Africa has to be understood in comparative terms as a process that has not followed industrialization. People have not moved to city because of the attraction of a newly established industrial sector, but rather to escape from rural areas in which the profitability of agriculture has been on the decline. And that's why we have a jobless city, not in the sense that people don't work, but in the sense that due to the lack of proper jobs, people end up working and improvising in ways that are often very unremunerative. And in this sense, as a starting point, you can see our understanding the economic structure and the historical pathway is essential to understand what agency the poor might possess, but within an understanding of the structural barriers. Enough of theory. Let's move to Dar es Salaam. And I take as a starting point question understanding how public transport works in Dar es Salaam, which of course, coming from a political economy background, immediately gets rephrased as a question of understanding for whom it works. There are different people with different interest and role in public transport. And I then take the quintessential radical political economy questions and apply them to the study of different aspects of public transport in Dar es Salaam. These questions are: who owns what? Who owns the buses in Dar es Salaam? Who owns the stations in Dar es Salaam? Who owns the streets of Dar es Salaam? Who does what with what they own? And answering these kind of questions, posing the study of public transport in this way, open the eyes to attention to the way in which different actors with different stakes in public transport try, with different degrees of success, to exercise power in the public transport. It's a journey in 7 stops. I'm going to try to give you a flavor of what are the questions and how these broad questions get refined. First one is a stop that sets the scene. In Dar es Salaam, the scene in the transition, as I said, from state provision to neoliberalism. And there are 2 key concepts that I use in the book to understand the messy U-turns and realities of the changing face of public transport. The first one is neoliberalism. Neoliberalism, which I understand loosely defined as a political project associated with policy that one way or another promote the freedom of capital of employers vis-à-vis the regulation of economic activities by the state. And is it a regulation that resulted in very unflattering and messy type of public transport that you can see from this photo, which represented just a normal day in Dar es Salaam? And because the impact of neoliberalism on the service was creating a legitimacy crisis for the government, that's where the second concept comes in, which is post-socialism. In other words, because the regulation of public transport has led to speeding, to very dangerous buses that are involved in accidents. In 1 year, 92% of lethal accidents in Dar es Salaam had one of these daladala involves. In chronic struggles between the students and the daladala workers, the government is called time and again to respond, to bring about some degree of a control, ownership by the public sector on public transport. And that's why it's interesting to use post-socialism as a concept, because when the government does try to intervene, it does mobilize the language of Ugyama, the language of public ownership of assets that has been laying dormant when the socialist project unfolded. Stop number 2 is about unpacking the private sector. Asking again who owns what, who does what with it, what are the sources of different actors' power. And this worker has written on the back of his bus, "Life is War," and he is referring to the war between bus owners and bus workers. The result of a questionnaire answered by about 700 of these workers shows that there is a clear class stratification. In other words, over 90% of these buses are operated by people who don't own even a sticker of these buses. So there is a clear division between those who own the buses and those who work with them. And what type of war are we talking about? The starting point has to come from this very clever worker that wrote Kazimbaya Ukiwanayo. In other words, this is unskilled work, and there are thousands of people who are desperate to find employment. So taking advantage of the oversupply of workers, employers don't exploit workers through exploitative wages per se. Rather, they ask for a daily fee, which is expected to be paid back at the end of each day. On top of that, workers need to pay for petrol. On top of that, they need to bribe policemen, pay for flat tires and any other expenditure that they might incur. And that's why what is left at the end of all this expenditure will be the daily return for workers. And what is important, therefore, is to understand that the many inefficiencies that characterize the operations of Daladala are related, structurally so, to very exploitative employment relations and to workers' response to this very hefty sum of money that they need to return each day. In other words, workers speed because they need to maximize the number of trips that they make each day. Workers overload the vehicles because they need to maximize the number of tickets that they sell for each trip. Workers refuse to ferry students because students are entitled to a discounted fare that nobody is subsidizing workers for. The second thing I do at this station is, at this stop, is understand why was I finding a story that was all about labor, and official statistics would suggest there's no such a thing as wage labor in the informal economy, only 0.7% paid employment, while if you add up self-employment in the informal economy, you get something like 97%. What I do is compare the Swahili words used by workers to describe their employment situation with the phrasing of labor force survey, showing the way in which labor force survey are rooted in an idea of labor markets that is very much has very much in mind the rich countries rather than the realities of employment in African cities. Stop number 3 is one of two which explore the politics of labor. And the first question is, why were 30,000 workers in the same city experiencing the same reality of exploitation, the same problems, failed to organize, to express an institution representing their interest vis-a-vis employers on the state? And what I try to do by hanging out the station, talking to workers, is to achieve a contextualized understanding of the sources of workers' power and vulnerability. And you find that there are many issues. The first one is the spatial unit of work, workers operating on atomized buses spread out over a very large area. And then the second one is labor heterogeneity, by which I mean that there is no such a thing as the Daladala workers. There are 3 distinct types of workers with different names in Swahili. Let me tell you briefly the names because we are in a Swahili-speaking country. The first one is Daladala men anaye maisha. This is the guy who has been given the bus by the owner and is expected to work 16 hours per day, from 4 a.m. to about 10 at night. But this is not humanly possible. And that's why after a few hours, 6, 5, 7, depending on the type of day, workers ambaya na maisha as a pause, as a stop, as a break. But the bus cannot stop, because otherwise you will not find enough money to pay at the end of the day. The hesabu, the daily sum, is very high. And that's where the second group comes in. Ambayo ni watu wa benchi, watu wasie na kazi, is the daladala worker who has lost work, maisha, having failed to return the money to the owner. And so he's there, hanging out the stations, waiting for a colleague to take a break, and he's going to operate this bus for 2-3 hours so that the bus keeps earning money, but the daladalaman ambaya na maisha is having a break. At the end of these 2-3 hours, this worker is going to dismantle and be paid enough money to buy a meal. So it's this strategy of surviving. The third one is the wapiga debe, those who bang on the body of the bus to fill the bus. For each bus they fill, they get given one fare, and then they move to the third bus. So these are people with different stakes in the labor process, different interest, and that's why this is a barrier to organization. Another thing I do is, okay, forget that they don't express an institution. What are the forms and limits of solidarity existing? And this is, I attended a meeting of one informal workers association grouping the workers on one route. And what was interesting is the inventive way in which workers were creating a mechanism, which I haven't got time to describe, to create an informal welfare fund. The workers were accessing to pay for food, pay for hospital, pay for funeral of members, and finally to bribe policemen if one of the association member is put in jail. So it's important we don't romanticize the potential of this kind of initiative to change the power balance, as Ailey Mary Tripp in her book Changing the Rules does in Tanzania. As I told you, there was a career break, and when I went back to Dar es Salaam in 2008, it was a completely different political landscape in which workers had organized. They started the UAMADA, the Association of Daladala Workers, which became a branch of COTUTI, the formal transport sector union. So the question, as you can imagine, say, how did this situation change? What was the spark to workers' organization? What was the strategy to organize? What were the results in claiming labor rights, which was the main objective of this organization? And the achievements were not small, because while at the beginning of the story, the Tanzanian state doesn't want to know who's working on its buses, by the end of the workers' organization, the Tanzanian state is asking that if you want a transport license to operate the daladala as an owner, you need to bring the contracts of the workforce. And these are all consequences of workers' organization. Stop number 5, get rich or die trying, as this guy wrote on the back of his bus, is a question that everyone working on poverty is, I think, one way or another trying to understand, because as an outsider it's very easy, I think, to mistake for hardship what is something that leads to dynamics of micro-accumulation. And this is a kind of question that has huge empirical challenges, because you're dealing about a workforce that you have no record of. So what I did is use the list of these informal workers association that I was talking about, that gave me a list of 120 people who I knew were daladala workers in 2001, and at 2 points in time, in 2009 and 2014, I tried to ask what were the occupational whereabouts of these people. And the findings are quite sobering, because you find that in 2014, half of these workers is stuck working in Daldalas, and of course getting older and less competitive in the labor market. Then you got 52% of the sample that falls in two subgroups. The first one is those who indeed move to slightly better job. The taxi driver, the private chauffeur, the lorry driver is the best case scenario. And within it, you have also burnout stories of people who get squeezed by this people's work become less and less reliable, so people don't give them work. And I call them burnout tragedies because there is a descent into alcohol addiction, drug addiction. 2 of the people I interviewed in the 90s were stoned to death because found stealing from houses. So stepping out of this, I think there are 2 points to make. One is that when I was interviewing people in the late 90s about this, they were saying, for me, dalla work ni passing time, kazi a passing time job that I'm doing now because there are no alternatives. But because the economic system in Tanzania is not very good at creating jobs and alternatives, this kind of occupation has become a lifetime occupation. There is indeed a very slow pace of occupational mobility that needs to be recorded, but we need to emphasize how slowly people move out to work on Dalla to better jobs. If you think of a classroom with 30 people, 1 person per year is allowed to move to something else. And then I think what I try to do at this stop is to put some flesh into these crude numbers, and so what I do is present some potted occupational biographies of about 12 of these men, both those who are stuck in Dallas and those who move to other things. Second last stop, the new face of neoliberalism, BRT, bus rapid transit, is bulldozed onto the scene by the World Bank, and I call it the new face of neoliberalism because it's quite clear that the BRT is conceived as a fix to open up public transport to the interest of international finance and very big corporate and often international companies. So what this stop does is 2 things. The first one is debunking what I call the BRT evangelical society. If you read scholarship about BRT, there is really a propaganda-like evidence behind the promotion that tells you that BRT is great for the economy, for the environment, for the poor. And then if you scratch the surface and try to understand who's behind much of the funding, behind both BRT research and implementation, what you do realize is quite a tightly knit set of institutions. The most important are the World Bank as an open door for international finance. There are some NGO brokers, ITDP, Embark, who if you look at their board, you find Goldman Sachs, the World Bank, Carlyle Investment Group. In other words, these NGOs that are trying to improve public transport for the poor, then on their board they got Goldman Sachs, which hasn't got a great record when it comes to the poor. And then you got Volvo Foundation, very important for knowledge production on BRT. As you can imagine, Volvo has vested interest in that they sell the buses that this BRT system then operate. I also look at the silence of this propaganda, the fact that they never talk about the tension, the mass occupation of stations in Colombia, the fact that fares always go up, which of course has important exclusionary consequences for the poor. The second thing we do at this stop is, of course, Tanzanian actors are not prepared to be pushed aside by the World Bank vision for the future of public transport. So what I try to do is to explore the political economy of resistance to BRT, resistance that made the implementation incredibly slow, resistance that led the World Bank nuts for the very important ways in which this local resistance changed the shape of the project in a way that is very different from the way in which the World Bank had imagined it. Final stop, roots end, and this guy is saying, we are also human, Asisi Watu. It's very important call. I think I take this call, and to me it means to do two kind of things. So I'm going to leave you with 2 kind of consideration. The first one is to go back to these theories and to say that ordinary cities, these are actually extraordinary cities in the sense that they are cities of ghosts. The protagonists of this literature are the amorphous urban poor, people at the grassroots, every day, but in a way, an everyday way of life that is an inch from the material and economic aspects of everyday life, something that is certainly the main preoccupation of very poor people. And so I want to really underline the incapacity or lack of interest of post-colonial scholarship to pin down materiality and economics, which of course has important implications for the political project that they believe we should follow, which is to imagine radical imaginings and interventions in a way that is resting on very vague concepts such as people as infrastructure. So the key point here is to emphasize how this celebration of the agency, the creative virtues of the initiative of the poor is dramatically lacking attention to the economic and political structures in which we need to locate the poor if we are not going to be patronizing about their agency. So I'm very interested in taking economic and political structure seriously and to really discover the humanity of the poor, which is also about giving space, voice to tragic story. This is Dotto, a career spent filling buses at station and say, any man with a sound brain knows that shouting a destination and pulling people into a bus is not a job. We do it because we are in trouble. And then he goes on to add, cleverness without results is pointless, which I think post-colonial scholars should remember about, because they often confuse tragic survivalism, this initiative, with a very ill-conceived conceptualization of the power of the poor to shape reality. I can't put a photo of the second worker because he was off his head with cognac at 10 a.m. in the morning. And he's saying, we sit here, we talk, a life of trouble, deep trouble. You sit with hunger and you see me today, I haven't got any bus or anything else. There is a tragedy of being stuck in Dar es Salaam with a family back in Tanga when he says, I can't go and visit when things are going well. How can I go when I haven't got even the money for breakfast? And then he ends up saying, we live like birds. Actually, a bird is better off as he knows that he will eat. There is no way out. So discovering the humanity of the poor is also about realizing that there are poor people who say we live like birds, even worse than birds. So Peters, again, is concerned that material deprivation becomes the only lens through which we read urban landscapes. My concern is the opposite, about this unsubstantiated celebration of the everyday, which I'm really passionate against because they crowd out a more meaningful understanding of the realities faced by everyday urban Africans and the possibilities for overcoming the challenges of their lives. Second and final point is about understanding that historically and empirically grounded political economy is, in my opinion, the best approach at our disposal. We need to really work hard empirically, as I try to do, but we need to avoid falling into extreme relativism as much of this kind of writing tends to do. So I conclude by going back to this initial question, what does define the urban experience in Africa in contrast to other parts of the world? And I think we all tackle this issue with the prior conceptual work. And to me, the answer is you cannot avoid attention to different levels of capitalist development because they result in marked difference in the level of economic growth, the income, and of course they have a huge impact on urban outcomes and possibilities. So the book, Taken for a Ride, wants to be a call for a contextualized understanding of urban capitalism, which today take the form of urban neoliberalism, and Taken for a Ride wants to really be a small contribution to that, with attention to the tension of urban neoliberalism and the contestation of urban neoliberalism. On this note, I will stop, and thank you for listening.
Thank you. I didn't realise you were such a good speaker, Matteo.
I listened to me before.
Well, I think once when we had a workshop here on Nobu Coming, and you broadcast us from. Yeah, do you remember that? Pete reminded me of this today. I think Pete's in the audience somewhere. We were talking about this earlier. But anyway, I think we'll all agree that was a wonderful discussion for a book launch, and much more than I'd expected. Now, I'm sure you've all got questions, but I'm going to abuse my position and start, Matteo, if you're willing.
Yeah.
You're willing. Okay. I mean, I think this, from what you said and from what I've seen of the book, I think this is all incredibly welcome. I mean, the celebration of informality that you've seen for the last 20 years is, the more you look at it, actually quite disgusting. really. I think it's disgusting that people celebrate, look at the agency of these informal traders, when really what we're talking about are people who are suffering, and they're suffering because of structural reasons. And often the people who are celebrating this informality are the people who themselves don't examine their own privileged position within those structures. So it is problematic. So I'm very sympathetic, and I think it's very, very important. And in fact, like all great realizations, you immediately think, why did it take so long for someone to say this? However, I do have a specific question, because although I think your arguments about that whole literature are very valid, I also think there is some of value in that other literature. I do think that there is something of value in looking at cities in ways beyond simply, and I really shouldn't use that word, beyond just the hard political economy, that there's something else also going on in cities. And so my question is how do we bring these two questions together? Because I think you're right. I think the whole swathe of literature that you've identified and which you position your own work against are deeply problematic, because they romanticize informality, because they are very vague, because they don't really look at the hard facts. They confuse agency, etc., etc., etc. But they also have something of value. So how do we bridge that theoretical gap between the two? Now, as a little hint, I wonder whether one answer may lie in the word materiality. Because the way you use materiality is the way that I would use materialism. Yeah? In a more Marxist sense. Well, when I think about materiality, I think more about stuff. Stuff that might have an economic dimension, but also has many more other kinds of dimensions. And maybe that is a way to cross between, say, something like Philip de Boek's book, which is remarkably immaterial, right? It's about the invisible city of Kinshasa, which always surprises me, because Kinshasa is such a material place. So the stuff is so evocative, right? So how do we bridge that gap, and maybe thinking about materiality in a way that encompasses both the kind of materialist look, a political economy look, but also something more coming from, say, the anthropology of material culture, for example, how I think of materiality, ontology even, perhaps, the relationship between stuff, matter and meaning, for example. So that would be one thing. And the other question is really, I want to probe you a little bit more on how you did your field work. I mean, I know you did this work over a very long time, but, I know you're not an anthropologist. We talked about this earlier. But you're also, you're a wannabe anthropologist. Can you tell us more about how you actually did your field work for this book?
Thank you. So let's start with the second one. So the field work starts... the work. So when we think about fieldwork, the first thing is I studied Swahili, and then through my studies I achieved some good degree of fluency. So the fieldwork was about starting point, huge reliance on newspapers, which I think are a very underused source to understand. Can you imagine how political public transport is? So they record the changes in politics, the contestations, the bigger picture trends that you get from that. So National Library of Dar es Salaam, a month just getting a sense of, from the early 80s to, well, it was 98, what was going on. There you identify who the key players are, which you follow up with interviews. And then in the scope of interviews, so I'm trying as I go along to relive the experience, interviews with workers, and then I design a questionnaire, because I would say, okay, am I picking up the exception and building a massive story about this, or is really the labor bus owner story central to the overall how public transport works question? So a questionnaire, quite slim, 15 questions, trying to understand who owns what, who does what when it comes to the bus. And that confirmed the centrality of wage labor. So I then picked up one station where I just began in a wannabe anthropologist way, to hang out, to ask questions, and you start realizing, discovering different categories of workers. You just observe once you are accepted and you're not these sensational Mzungus hanging out at the station. Why did you do that? What's the meaning of that? So already there is some attention to meaning, I think. And then when it comes to the political organization, lack of organization in the 90s, when I kept following that line of inquiry, at some point one of these workers said, well, if you are interested in these things, you need to come to the meeting of the association, which, you know, in the way you find out accidentally. So 2001, 2002 is the time when I start getting out of the archive, because I still find my previous project more exciting than the one I'm doing for my PhD, to try to shadow as much as I can this association meeting, then access to the minutes, and that. That's the end of a phase. Then, as I said, when I come back to Dar es Salaam in 2008, I find that it's a completely different scenario of organization. So, identifying who started Uwamada. Uwamada then takes me to Kotuti. And meanwhile, I'm interviewing workers about what they see about this organization. And then the key source, and I think the single most exciting source in the book, is the correspondence in Swahili between Uwamada and Kotuti, which I was kindly allowed to consult. And why is that exciting? Because you find, in a very non-reductionist Marxist way, how all the early phase of organizing was about establishing a shared meaning of exploitation, where the informal workers is trying to educate a formal trade union or person who doesn't know anything about this type of employment. What does it mean to be a Daladala workers, and also to provide ammunition in terms of what are the economics of this sector, what is the space for providing contracts, because the typical objection expected was it's too poor a sector to provide contracts. So there is a lot of attention to meaning. And then the other thing that started happening is BRT. So in these trips, I was one time I prefer to focus either on the organization, on BRT, and then 2 times in 2009, 2014, I was doing this very time-consuming but exciting work of sitting down with 2 sets of informants with this list and say, where is Jost? Where is Joseph? And then once I had the picture in place, I cleared the 2, 3, 4 cases of disagreement between the two on a motorbike, trying to follow up as many of these to interview and say, okay, how did you move away from Daladala? What was the connection? What was Daladala work allowed you to do? And to get this kind of understanding. And that leads me to the second and more conceptual point, which is materiality, materialism. So the first thing is, maybe this is a discussion to be developed, but I would like to know more about what do you find useful about this literature, because you haven't elaborated fully. But for me, what is interesting is even the materials that these post-colonial guys presents is enough to turn their own argument on its head. So to give you an example, Simone has some brutal facts about the cities in West Africa that he's working on, including a story that I cite in the book about one of these minibuses running over a child and people getting out of the back door of the streets where this and setting fire to the bus and killing the workers. So for me, it's amazing how these guys managed to spin this upbeat story despite some of the evidence. You know, the book has a spectacular photo of Kinshasa, which is an utterly devastated urban landscape, and yet it managed to spin this story about the possibilities of this urban configuration. So I think, first of all, I would be curious to understand, and this is a question I got by other people, and say, you're throwing the baby away with the water. I say, for me, there's no baby here. It's just murky water. It's postmodern junk. You know, you can quote me on this. And that is, materialism. Of course, the issue of meaning is crucial, and I try to really, a lot of the work is to understand the meaning of things and the meaning of trends. But I think, materialism, if done in a way that is not crude, is not ideological, is not sitting in an armchair, is very human and about materiality. So that would be my question, my answer to your question.
I think you've evaded my question, actually. I mean, But that's good, because you're making me think harder. I guess my quest, and the reason we're having this long discussion is because we're working on a big project called Nairobi Becoming, and we're kind of confronted with this question too. Because at one level, Nairobi you could interpret very much in a kind of Kinshasa way, of this imaginative place where loads of people are doing all sorts of crazy things, and yet at the same time it's also a starkly divided city. It's one of the most unequal cities I've ever lived in, right? I mean, it's such a divided city that how can you incorporate both those aspects? And that is kind of my quest. Now, I'm not sure that I can answer that yet, but it seems to me that your answer is you're sticking to your guns with the political economy approach.
I'm saying water. Water. Who owns the tanks to move water around? Where do you get water from? How do you relate with the city council and protect your business? And then there are the small people who are making a living. But I think, starting from this kind of very material question has a lot of mileage in understanding the meaning. And so that's why I keep asking, what is it that gets left out, and what do I need to rescue from this literature I'm criticizing? Because it's not that you find much meaning. I invite you to read Natal Mbembe's work on Johannesburg. I don't know whether you read it. It's a very famous book about Jordan Africa. It's astonishing. This guy sat down in a shopping mall in Johannesburg, which is a city where 1 woman out of 3 is raped, where you go to clubs and there is the sign "No guns allowed," and they spin this story about different sociality. There is deeply an elite story, which is disconnected from the reality that the ordinary residents face. Yeah, but as I said,
I think we're not going to end this. I mean, I guess one comeback you might get from that perspective would be, but it isn't all stories of misery. There are also people doing incredibly well, and why there would be a counter-accusation, which would say, well, Joburg is also a very exciting place to be. There's loads of exciting things happening. It's not only a miserable place. But I don't think we should hog this conversation anymore, and I'm sure we've given the audience enough of a burden to sort of listen to us. Please, does anyone have any questions or comments?
Don't be shy.
Don't be shy.
This is a very that was a very good presentation on the book launch. My question is, you have spent about 15 years doing your research in Tanzania and in one of the countries in Africa. So what are you leaving behind? What does your book seek to achieve for the people of Tanzania and for Africa in general?
Good question. Anyone else have a question so we can give our speaker 2, just not to make it too easy for them? Okay, why don't you answer?
There's another question.
Okay.
It's a good presentation on the book. I think it has a lot we can learn from. But my question is simply, you've been in Tanzania for quite some time. Do you think BRT has really been implemented successfully? And is it a model that Africa countries can borrow from and implement in other countries?
Great questions. So the first one, first of all, an anecdote. When I was finishing this book, the publisher, or in the peer review process, was saying, okay, you need to put in the conclusion some comments on what should be done to improve public transport in Dar es Salaam. What's your position? And I resisted that, because this is a book, if you say one take-home point, which is public transport is all about power, but power struggles between different kind of actors with different interest in the shape of public transport, the bus owners, the workers, the World Bank, the proponents of BRT that want to displace the BRT. So if you take that approach seriously, it would be both very easy but very useless of me sitting in my SOAS office explaining what should be for the common good of the people be done about public transport, right? And I think, but that doesn't mean that I don't get involved in the actions. And so tonight, when I finish this, I get on a plane and go to Dar es Salaam, where there is a workshop where ITF, which is the global union of transport workers, is trying to bring together a number of African transport trade unions to understand BRT and to understand how it is different from the propaganda-like evidence that I described in my chapter, because it's really a story that is propelled by this story that is good for the environment, for the economy, for the poor. But in reality, when you see its implementation, it has huge problems associated, above all the fact that it is resulting in higher fares than the pre-existing systems, right? So that's my small contribution. When you do get involved in this contribution, you might find out my ideas, understanding of what is good or wrong about BRT is then taken or not forward by different unions who have their own constraints agenda. So if you get close to the action, you realize how limited is the role of the scholar / activist, which is a very different kind of game from the consultant that writes report that then nobody reads. In terms of BRT as a model, in Tanzania, the idea was that it's operating on exclusive lanes, right? And the daladalas are phased out from these lanes so that you have 2 lanes in which the BRT buses operates and 2 lanes in which private cars are moving, right? That is interesting in itself because it shows that when you go in and spend $1 billion to change the face of public transport, you don't want to touch the interest of large car owners who are the main source of congestion. That is a political choice, but something that you wouldn't pick up if you read BRT analysis. Now, when the BRT fares were announced, the promise was BRT fares will be comparable to Daladala fares. When they were announced, they were 55% higher than the Daladala fares. And you can imagine what kind of a response this got from people, passengers, and from the government. So to accommodate this, also because the political presidential elections were coming up, radical changes were made to BRT, and the decision was taken not to phase out Daladalas. So that now you have a highly dysfunctional transport system in which, if you are middle class and you can pay 650 shillings, you're going to board these buses that take you from Kimara to Posta 11 kilometers in 25-30 minutes. Amazing. If you're poor and you can't afford 650, you operate on the 2 lanes where you are stuck with private cars, and the same distance, 11 kilometers, can take 1.5 hours to 2 hours. So you can see how is that a good model where you use a scarce resource, BRT, taxpayer money, to create a system that the poor cannot afford. The middle class is traveling very quickly, and poor people are stuck in traffic with the very rich that the BRT intervention didn't want to touch. And that is just the beginning of the story, because then you talk to the BRT interim operation and say, this 650 shilling fee is too low. It's not sustainable. We need operating subsidies. And then the government turns around and say, but you told us that it was going to be comparable to Daladala fares and that it was going to be subsidy free. Now Daladala comes in and say, but if we need an operating subsidy, we have been providing public transport for 30 years without subsidies. Can we get the subsidy ourselves and recapitalize? And that leads me to what kind of scenarios could we think in very abstract terms, because the problem is policies don't develop like this. You need the space, resources, you need administrations that want to play with this idea. And I think when you put that kind of money in place, you can think again revamping public ownership of public transport, or putting subsidies to recapitalize and improve the existing fleets of daladalas, and here would be matatus, in a way that maybe is less disruptive when it comes to job distractions, right? And these are issues that are not floated on the table when changes in the public transport systems are made. Why? Back to square one, because those who push for BRT, and they are the only one that gives you money. So in other words, if you wanted to change things in Dar es Salaam late 1990s, the option was not what do we do about public transport. It's like, do you want to do a BRT? Come to Bogota, the funds are available. On the way back to Bogota, come to Washington, we'll make you meet with the head of transport at the World Bank. And before you know it, you come back and the line of $150 million have been activated. And that's why this is about power. I keep repeating that. It's not about white canvas discussions about what should be do. And so the contribution is very limited but important, distracting or trying to show the cracks of this story that tells you that BRT is great for the poor, and you're going to see it very soon in Nairobi if you don't do something about it. And so the idea is they hope that people from Nairobi come back, learn how it really works, and put these questions to those who are pushing for BRT, because I can guarantee to you these problems, issues will not be raised. And when they come up, it's too late. Yeah.
Thank you, Prof. One thing that I'm keen on as I sit here is the ownership of BRT. We welcome the issue of BRT, and we are all in agreement that public transport is the only solution to our transportation problems. But it is good that Nairobi learns from other countries. We have South Africa, we have Lagos, now we have our own neighbors, Tanzania. And we are likely to go the Tanzanian way, ownership of the BRT. We have 30% of the matatu owners. We have 70% going to the government and other private investors. Now, in that case, if we go that direction, are we really getting the solution? Because you already know that the current ownership is. If I can put it, it is disorganized, disorderly, chaotic. And from my thinking, I think if we go back to that direction, we are likely to have a similar experience. I don't know. What's your take?
Thank you. I just want to, I'm not sure there's a question or observation on the exploitation of the workers. And as you presented, I was just wondering, there's exploitation of the workers by the owners of these vehicles, more or less. But I was wondering then, who are these owners? Have we even tried to understand who the owners are? Do they also belong to a class of the exploited, for instance? Because many of them possibly who own the vehicles and are not very wealthy are perhaps owners of these vehicles where they are paying hefty loans, and therefore they're also being pushed by banks and cooperative societies to pay. So, and for this reason, perhaps they also forced really push these workers to the limits, which, okay, I don't agree with, but again, what kind of system do we have? Is it one that actually is perpetuating exploitation of the owners and therefore then of the workers? And then how do you get out of these suckers? When you talk about the BLT, it's really, for me, very worrying, because Kenyans are running to Dar es Salaam to really learn and benchmark on what is purported to be good practice. I think the case of Dar es Salaam is better than ours, because at least they have a dedicated, really properly done, dedicated BLT lane. I think the Kenyan case is really one that is a joke, if you ask me, because it's just a red paint. Kenyans are joking that somebody just got a contract to do the paint work. So I'm not sure where it will take us. And also considering that, for example, where they're even trying the BLT is not really from homes. It's really just on the highway. how do you get even to the highway to take that bus? And and this now leads me to the final question on which I really like, the political economy of resistance to BLT. And I'm really wondering, what hope does Kenya have, and what is it that we can run in terms of resistance? I mean, we're just sitting and watching the government and of course World Bank and others who are behind it, which of course some of us have sat with. But how do you even build this resistance that is so really remarkable that eventually we see changes? I know workers are not represented, especially in this country. Only a few organizations that really say that they're representing workers sit with the World Bank and other organizations, but many of them are not represented. Again, how do you build this resistance? Thank you.
I think you can take one more question.
Okay, I really want to appreciate the presentation. My question is, you talk of frustrations on the part of workers in the transport sector, what we call in Kenya the touts, those waiting for you to go it. So is there any link between the frustration on the workers and increasing crime rates in urban centers? Yeah, urban crime, that is.
Okay, thank you so much. Obviously, resistance, I don't know Kenya well at all, so it would be foolish of me to make predictions about what is the potential of the way for resistance. I think though what needs to be understood is that BRT are not built as gift through grants, they're built through loans, which of course will require taxpayer money to repay. So one interesting side effects of this kind of institutional setup, their public-private partnership, is that it can explode the tensions, contradictions of a system where Kenyans have very little to say about something that ultimately they will have to pay. And when all these problems with BRT were emerging and the dream of what BRT was going to be hit the ground, you see, and I use that, newspaper columns, letters from saying, I said, but if we're going to pay for it, can we have more of a say? About what is problematic about the World Bank saying we need an operator that has previous experience of operating BRT, for example, which means by default that no Tanzanian will be able to own this. And through this kind of exploding the tensions, the government steps in, tries to accommodate this. Also, the government is playing a nationalist kind of game, narrative, very aggressively so in Tanzania, and at the time when BRT is implemented. So I think what I want to say is context specific, what what form of resistance will take, but the key framework is this idea that BRT, at the end of the day, are paid through domestic resources, right? And that opens up the door for a number of criticisms to those who push the loans and expect to have control over the shape of this BRT. And they were really domesticated in the case of Tanzania, as I try to show empirically by tracing the way the system changed. So, for instance, when fares were too low, the government said, forget about exclusive lane, the Dallas will operate in parallel, otherwise we're going to face a big legitimacy issue for taking the big arteries in Dar es Salaam and excluding the poor for it. So that's one. The second one is infrastructure. BRT is much cheaper than rail. The motto is think rail, see bus, right? But it still is quite expensive because the kind of infrastructure you build needs to carry 150-seater buses that have a very heavy weight. It's not a normal road, right? So if you are able to stop it early, that's where you open the door to thinking of other ways that maybe comes with very much cheaper infrastructure. And so you say it's a joke, there is just a red line. I say maybe that's your exit clause, because it's much easier to unpaint a red corridor and do something else than to operate with this very expensive highway in the city that you are stuck with, right? So that might be your blessing. The point is, though, I do expect that this infrastructure will be built to carry buses that are of a certain weight. So I don't know the technicalities of BRT, but I think having other forms of infrastructure is something to be explored. And what could they mean for a country like Kenya, which maybe doesn't, like Tanzania, have the cutting edge public transport? These are among the poorest countries in the world. So why do you have a top class transport system at the expenses of what? Industrial policy, health, education, other things we could do with this money, right? The workers' story is complicated because this is market driven and operated. One built-in clause is that you might train, you have resources in place to skill up workers of matatus to be able to drive BRT buses, but these are buses that cost $150,000. So at the end of the day, there is only so far in terms of employers' willingness to give these buses to people. In the case of Dar es Salaam, a significant number of workers have been successful in making the transition. There are a good percentage of workers that come from other things, like driving a lorry is much more conducive to drive one of these buses than a daladala, given the length. But even if you make every single BRT bus driven by a former Matatu workers, you need to still understand that with BRT you kill 7 out of 8 public transport jobs. Why? Because you are replacing smaller buses with very, very large buses. Ownership. What is the nature of ownership? They are a group that was quite difficult to study. You know, they are registered as individuals, not with an address associated with that, and the practice of having a name lending where I'm the real owner, but you have just registered because I'm a big shot, I don't want to be recognized as an owner, is referred to by many informants. So the way I went about this is, one, consult the grey literature, and B, snowballing, where you meet a few owners and get a sense. And then a key informant for me in the book was my former flatmate when I was staying at the University of Dar es Salaam, who ended up being a Daladala owners, and then he was my landlord in 2001. So it's through him that I got a lot of the insights of what it means to operate a bus. And what this grey literature and him was confirming is that there are 3 types of owners of Daladalas. One is the big shots that hide, with traffic police sometimes being both the one who police the sector and own the buses. Genuine businessmen who invest in this sector, about 1/3, but these are all very claims that you can't really strongly empirically back up. And then is the retired academic or even an active academic who invest in this as a top-up to shrinking wages. And the other characteristics to flag up is that ownership is not concentrated. In other words, there are 7,000 buses, and on average you have 2-3 buses as an operator. So you don't have a big player who's operating as a cartel and in an oligopolistic fashion. And finally, the people refer to Daladala business as a relay business, where there are quite a lot of people that don't have any understanding of mechanics. They are misled by how much money they see changing hands. They invest in this, and very quickly they start eating serious losses and give up and pass the buck to someone else who is more either a newcomer with so much naivety and enthusiasm, or someone who has a better understanding of mechanics and therefore is able to navigate the system, to understand when it's time to sell, what is the right service. Otherwise, I don't know how much you understand, Anne, about mechanics, but if you walk with a Matatu to the garage, and this Matatu has driven thousands of miles each week, and this mechanic is going to tell you, you need to replace, Professor, the head gasket. That is a lot of money, and you need to know your mechanics. And that, so there is this reference to owners who don't understand the business. Frustration of workers, crime, is there a link between the two? Obviously, the Wapiga Debe are precisely that. They are petty criminals that impose themselves on the workforce. In other words, if you don't let them fill your bus, they're going to smash your tire or window. And that is the biggest wedge within the workforce, while the boundaries between those on the bench and those who are overworked are much looser, and people tend to move from one to the other.
I think we'll take one more round of questions, and then we'll let Matteo off the hook. I think he's doing quite well. Some tough questions there. I've got one question, and it'll be very quick, and it will probably betray my ignorance. But in Kenya, there's this whole Sacco thing going on. How do you understand that? And is there something like this in Tanzania? And if there was, what would it look like? And is this something that's quite unique to Kenya? To me, it strikes me as something quite unique to Kenya, but I'd like to know more your view on that. And then I saw you first, so with the white shirt, and then we're going back. Oh, you have the mic. Go ahead.
Thank you. Two issues. First is linked to the ownership that she asked, because if you look at the main players within the Matatu sector, we have these informal employees, these people who are employed and are not formal. In the introduction of BRT, drawing from your experience in Dar es Salaam, how are the informal players, maybe the workers within the Matatu, now the Daladala and the bus owners, taken care of? Secondly, the issue of political will in driving this big project. BRT is not a small issue, it's very big. How did the issue of politics or the political goodwill influence the introduction and the running of the BRT in Tanzania, so that Kenya can pick or draw that as a lesson? Thank you.
I think I love the presentation first, because when you talk about PE, political economy of a public transport or transport in itself, for me, I think it is a good starting point to getting the solution that we have in public transport. Because then when you get to know the power plays that really come on board when you talk about public transport. But there's one thing that I've really noted that is a bit grey when you talk about who owns what in public transport. And I think there's a small clique of elite decision makers that we often miss when we talk about public transport. And these are the people who make the decisions in public transport. It is a group that is exclusive, right? And I'm afraid I'll offend my friend, because I told him earlier, he's a transport engineer. I told him that transport decisions are always technical and elite driven, even the planning itself. So the Daladala owners, for example, are often excluded from that process. And this elite group, they're the ones who really, I always feel they really benefit. I know when you talk about who owns what, you'll talk about Goldman Sachs, World Bank. These are the funders, right? Those are it's just one side of the stakeholders. Then you talk about the bus owners, the operators, but there's this clique that you often leave here. And this clique they're the ones who determines if they're going to receive the loan from Goldman Sachs or who. They're the ones who are very quick to implement even you can see right now we are painting the road there, but there has to be an invincible hand, and this is the elite class that is really trying to implement this thing very quickly. Right? But in this entire discussion, I think we give them a very small attention. But I think when we're talking about the political economy of transport in itself, this elite class, they play a key role in decision making, and they are the ones who decide if this BRT, for example, is going to benefit the Daladala people or if it's going to benefit themselves. Right? Through means that we really on the table we can see. So mine is just an observation that it is probably important to really not gloss over this elite class, but really look at it. Because transport, for me, from what I've learned, the decisions are very elite driven. And there's no proper public participatory process that you are called in, even in Nairobi, that now we want to do this, and the Dalala guys are called on board and asked, what do you think? You guys have been in this industry for long, what do you think? I think that's more sufficient.
Okay, I think one more question. Okay. Oh, Sharath. Yes.
Hi, Eust. Thank you, Matteo. Sorry I arrived late, but congratulations on the book. I have a question which is a bit less Kenya specific and more about the politics of your argument. I know the argument well enough, even though I wasn't here for the presentation. And one thing that sort of strikes me is that you can have unlikely bedfellows in some of the kinds of critiques we have of what Scott would refer to as sort of high modernist visions, and maybe it's not as high modernist as it used to be, but these sorts of BRTs are nevertheless some kind of modernist vision, right? And so you have this unlikely bedfellows, because on the one hand you have really market-driven people who don't really like this BRT and are probably happy with a more chaotic market-style solutions to emerge that have less public investment and are just driven by the forces of exchange that allow for survival in the city to keep going. They're not particularly fussed about these investments, and then you have these sorts of critiques, in a sense, from the progressive side of politics, from the left, which say this is World Bank coming in, imposing a particular ideal, benefiting sort of powerful groups, not really consulting properly with people, putting people out of jobs, making sure the poor pay more money for transport. And it worries me that that's actually an unlikely set of bedfellows, right? That you have the sort of more neoliberal market-driven people and the really progressive radical people both critiquing the same thing. And I'm just wondering if you go back to sort of big transformations, great transformations, I mean, none of them come perfect and easy. Is there a problem that big transformations in the African continent, which are never going to be perfect, are going to be critiqued heavily from a very progressive end, saying you haven't consulted the poor properly, you haven't considered the amount of people who are going to lose jobs, and we're somehow undermining modernist, some transformations that are critical to the future of the continent?
I think there's plenty for you to go on with there.
Yeah. Let me try. So, SACCO, no, this is very... In some other countries you have some degree of cooperative, but how dominant they are is a very Kenyan thing. And I think for me to read about other African cities and their public transport is a constant reminder of how we need not to make sure to understand the specificities of the histories. In Tanzania, that is not the case. And even when it comes to SACCOs are so central given the source of funding that allows people to become. But the vast majority of Daladala owners buy with their own resources. So that explains. But you're spot on the fact there is a Kenyan particular things. And I don't understand enough. I haven't done much research on SACCOs to have an opinion. But they are a very interesting institution to study, to understand. The political will question, that is really essential. And I think that's why if you look at the stop number 6 and say, well, okay, what are the causes that allow the delay of BRT that was reported as imminent in 2002 and finally launched in 2015. I have 2 layers. One is the proximate causes of this delay, which is the barriers that were driving nuts the implementers of BRT. I'm talking about 137 house owners who take BRT to court because they don't want to be expropriated from the place that the scheme planners have selected as the control tower of BRT, right? Or they are, fairly small things. And then the book asks, hold on a minute, in the greater good of great transformation that Sharath was talking about, these are things that you would expect the government to step in and say, hey guys, this is for the common good. But that's why, and I think I'm trying to answer both at once, pushing for BRT in the way the World Bank would have wanted it created the huge legitimacy issues for the government, because Kikwete is quoted to have said BRT has come to kill Dala jobs. Now, which is partly true, it might be for a better good, but you have 30,000 people, pretty rough. You can imagine the Matatu workforce, the Dala workers, and in a context where urban votes are becoming more and more a key issue for CCM, which has been in power forever, but they don't take for granted that they'll be in power forever. Then you have the World Bank that says, no, you need previous experience of this, and then you have a class of Dala owners, many of whom, but not everyone, very close to the government, and say, what about us? We've been operating without any subsidy for 35 years. Now the money comes and you want to put us aside? So what happens is, these are all things that there is a deeper level, which is about political will. Precisely, that's how the book frames. And I think it's important because often, in the literature of BRT, you do read that there are problems with implementation, but there are always project failure, which is very technical. The plan was great, the implementation, we could have been sharper, but it's not as simple as that. It's just that this win-win story is implausible, and the legitimacy power of those who try to resist this is strong enough to force the World Bank plan to be domesticated, tamed, and compromised, right? And I think on the question, we need to pay attention to this elite, the clique. This is what I try to do. I think the key point is there's no such a thing as a technical approach to a thing like public transport that moves so much money around and influence how millions of people move every day. So when you read an approach that presents itself as technical, that in itself is a political choice, right? A choice to frame out some of the tensions, a choice to present it as a win-win, which is a typical development narrative, right? Now, it's true that every great transformation is messy. Think about Chinese socialism or the great transformation everywhere. In the UK, there are winners and losers, earthquake assessments. But I think, the book doesn't romanticize for a second the pre-existing system, and so in itself he agrees that something has to be done. What it does want to show, though, is that this is not a noble plan that has some side effects that are pernicious. As I explained, the issue that you spend so much money and then the poor people can't access it is an aberration. And the fact that if you're rich, you travel in half an hour, and if you're poor, you travel in 1.5 hours is really penalizing for the poor. So it is a point of saying this is a way of opening up public transport to the interest of international finance. And I think I'm not saying anything controversial when I say that we live in a world where increasingly finance has a problem of finding new markets, and BRT is a dream, because if you get a BRT contract, you have a 30-year revenue guaranteed contract. So it is a no-risk uncertainty system. And the final point on the bedfellows, I think that one who would like just the state to get out, the market fundamentalism, they are very hard to find these days, because the mess that the deregulation has created has made, A, this is a very implausible argument, and B, the profitability of the sectors when there has been no investment in infrastructure is really low. So I think what the book does, and this is a very important point, is to understand how the changing face of neoliberalism has been changed. 1980s, Thatcher, Reagan, roll back the state, structural adjustment in Africa, just get out, let the market rules. Today we talk, I think, meaningfully about roll out neoliberalism, where the idea is to restructure this market with public sector funding to enable new opportunity for investment and accumulation for private sector. So it is about the state capture, the capture of funds by the state that allow investment. And that is still neoliberalism. We don't need to misunderstand neoliberalism as something that is adverse to state intervention. We need to always ask, what is this intervention for? If you ask that, you see, okay, conditionality number one, private ownership of the BRT system. Conditionality number 2, foreign, because nobody in Kenya or Tanzania has ever done this. And then it gets negotiated as part of politics. I think that was all. I don't know whether I've missed anything. Yeah? Thank you for these great questions, by the way.
I mean, I think we could probably talk forever, but I also think we should probably stop and give Matteo a break. I think there are still more drinks, so please help yourselves. But before you do that, let's put our hands together and thank Matteo for this, and go and read his book. Also, I think we have a seminar tomorrow at 11. Silkao, do you have a title to hand? Do you have and a mic?
Neglected, about the boy child in Kenya.
Yeah, so that looks like a good event. So if you're around, please come along. Nice to see you all here today.